Welcome to this edition of The Wise Owl. A video series that features interviews with faculty members of the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the University of Montevallo. I'm your host, Scott Turner, and today we're going to be chatting with Dr. Bob Barone. Dr. Barone earned his PhD in history from Ohio State University. And
that's the Ohio State University.
The Ohio State University. And he is the author of A Reputation History of John Dee, 1527 to 1609, The Life of an Elizabethan Intellectual. And today, Bob is going to be chatting with us about Henry VIII and the English Reformation. So I have to confess, I'm a little rusty on my English history. Therefore, my first question to you, Bob, is who was Henry VIII and why should I care?
Well, Henry VIII was the second king in the Tudor dynasty to rule in England. He came to the throne in 1509 at the tender age of 17. Why he is important and significant for history, other than the fact that he had 6 wives, was the fact that he led England in their break from the Roman Catholic Church. And so whatever you think of Henry's intellectual abilities, and he gets a lot of criticism perhaps for not being the brightest bulb in the box, he certainly has a tremendous impact on what he did for the course of English history, and to a larger extent, the course of the English-speaking world in terms of breaking the connections and ties with Rome. And the interesting thing, as we'll elaborate on, I guess, in the course of our conversation, is that the English Reformation takes a different course than the European Reformation, which you can say, begins with Martin Luther's break from Rome, and that's theological in nature. The motivation and the cause of Henry's break from Rome is political and personal. It has to do with his marriage to his first wife, Catherine, and trying to get out of that. When you look at Henry theologically, from a theological perspective, he's very conservative. He's very Catholic in his position. In fact, he venomously goes out against the Lutherans when Lutheranism comes on the scene after 1517, and he persecutes Lutherans. So he's hardly a reformer in the continental sense of that word. It's a whole different set of dynamics, a whole different set of circumstances that's unfolding in England.
So to help me a little more with the timeline, okay, you made mention of Martin Luther, who really.
Okay, so Henry VIII became king in 1509. Martin Luther posts his 95 Theses, which is traditionally seen as the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, in 1517, October 31st, 1517. Henry, and of course, not long after that, there are Lutheran influences that begin to percolate into England. So there are individuals in England, theologians in England, other individuals that are gravitating towards Luther's new interpretation of Scripture. Of course, the English church at that point is still a Catholic church, still in union, still in communion with Rome, still under the authority of the Pope in Rome. Henry's issues begin in 1527, connected with his marital difficulties he's having, and that is going to begin the cascade effect that ultimately leads to England's ultimate break from Rome that occurs in 1533, 1534. And then throughout the course of the 16th century, it's really a sort of cascade effect, because in the 1530s, 1540s, while Henry is still king, you have what's commonly referred to as the Henrician Church, right? The Henrician Church is basically a Catholic church doctrinally, except there's no pope anymore. Then after he dies and his son Edward takes the throne as Edward VI, then you really see a true Protestant Reformation occurring in England doctrinally, the so-called Edwardian reforms that are taking place. And then, of course, the problem with Edward is he dies too young. He died of, most scholars would agree that he died of tuberculosis, most likely at the age of 15, just short of his 16th birthday. And so he never married, he never had issue. So there's no continuation of that line of the dynasty. And then according to Henry VIII's will, the throne went to Edward's elder half-sister, Mary. Problem with Mary, the product of the first marriage of Henry to Catherine of Aragon, is that she's Catholic. And so now the English church gets dragged back into the folds of Catholicism. And then in 1558, with the death of Mary, Mary also had no issue, even though she was 42 years old. She never was able to get pregnant. Most likely she had a tumor that prevented any pregnancies. But at any rate, she died childless. And so then the throne will go to her half-sister, Elizabeth. And under Elizabeth, you have the Elizabethan Reformation, which basically is the creation of the Anglican Church in the 1558 to 1563. You basically have the formation of the Anglican Church. And with very little theological exception, it's the same church today in England. The Anglican Church is the same church doctrinally that, I mean, for the most part, obviously there have been certain theological reforms over the years, but nothing that upsets the basic model of the church that was established under Elizabeth. Okay, so
all right.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of information there.
Yeah.
So let me back us up just a little bit.
Okay.
So you've conveyed to me that Henry is not a religious radical. He's not a Lutheran. He's not a Calvinist. That's not
Right.
what's making him tick. So can you walk us through the personal story of
Henry was the third child and the second son of his father, Henry VII, and his mother, Elizabeth of York. And so in his early life, there was no thought that he was going to become king at any point. And so his young education, he received a very good education, what we would call a Renaissance education, very heavily influenced in language. He was fluent. He was fluent in Latin. He was fluent in French, and he could understand Italian. And he also, because of his early education, prided himself at being something of a theologian, because Henry VII's original intentions were to train him for the church and have him made a bishop or, some position like that. But then everything changes very radically and very quickly when the elder brother, Arthur, died at the age of 16. Henry at that point was age 10, right? And so all of a sudden now this 10-year-old becomes the new heir apparent to the throne. And so now his direction is going to change dramatically. His position in life is now going to be the heir apparent to the throne. Where the problem begins in terms of the English Reformation is the fact that Arthur had been married to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was the younger daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, of Castile and Aragon, right? The nation that's going to become unified as Spain, right? And Henry VII, who's always a shrewd political thinker, realizes that he needs to make shrewd dynastic connections with his children, marital connections. And so he makes these very shrewd marital alliances. So he marries the eldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, thus connecting England with the growing might of Spain, right? The New World has just been discovered, all of that business, and Spain is on the road to becoming the dominant nation of the 16th century. Just as a side note,
yeah, go ahead.
Just as a side note, the eldest daughter, Margaret, she gets married off to the King of Scotland, and so connecting links between England and Scotland. There had been long enmity between England and Scotland, and so he's trying to resolve all of that. And then the younger daughter, Mary, she gets married off to the King of France, so making dynastic bonds with France. Now, where does Henry VIII come in? So at the age of 10, the older brother Arthur dies. Henry VII, doesn't want to lose the dowry and doesn't want to lose the connection with Spain. And Ferdinand of Spain wants the same thing. They both want the same thing. And so what they have to do is they have to work with the papacy, because according to church laws, right, degrees of affinity, right, you can't marry relatives that are too close to you, right? And so the marriage of one brother to another brother's widow is generally seen as a no-no. And so there has to be special church dispensation that's granted in order for that to take place. Well, they get the dispensation. Pope Julius II grants the dispensation that then allows Henry to marry his brother's widow. The marriage doesn't take place for years. Catherine, Henry's first wife, was 6 years older than him, right? She was his elder, and Henry doesn't marry her until after his father's death, when he becomes king. And then the first act he will do as king, honoring his father's designs, is to marry Catherine. And by all indications, it appeared to be a happy marriage. The two seem to get along with each other. The only problem with the marriage is Catherine couldn't bear him a son. And she had numerous pregnancies. She had at least 7 pregnancies. So I could go through the order of these pregnancies. So they married in 1509. Her first pregnancy in 1510 was a son who lived for about a month, a little over a month, and then he died. Then the second pregnancy was a stillborn son. The third pregnancy was either a miscarriage or another stillborn son. The fourth pregnancy was the daughter, Mary, who will live, the only child of the first marriage that makes it to adulthood was Mary, but she's a girl, so that's going to be problematic because there's never been a queen that reigned in England before, right? And then the remaining pregnancies were all stillbirths. They were after the birth of Mary in 1516. There was a stillbirth in 1517, a stillbirth in 1518, and then I think the final one was 1525. And so in Henry's mind, this is clearly God's design. Where has there been a better act of scripture coming to fruition? And the particular scriptural passage, and Henry always prided himself as something of a biblical scholar because of his theological training he had received, right? And so Henry always harped back to a reading from the book of Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21, where it says, a man who marries his brother's widow uncovers his brother's nakedness, and the marriage shall be barren. So where is there a better fulfillment of scriptural prophecy than in Henry's marriage to Catherine? And in fact, that's one of the principal grounds he's going to use as the argument for the divorce, is that it is breaking with biblical law, that the marriage should have never taken place in the first place. And God, of course, is clearly punishing them by not giving them the son that they are desperately in want of, right? Then the other legal grounds that Henry will use for divorce is that the Pope never should have granted the papal bull allowing the marriage in the first place. From a legal point of view, Henry is making all the wrong arguments. Henry Henry prided himself as a theologian, but he's really not that bright, and he really does make the wrong legal choices in how he's going to proceed with his, use the term divorce. I guess what he was really pushing for was an annulment to the marriage. The idea, an annulment, the idea that the marriage never was a true marriage in the first place, right? So at any rate, that process all began in 1527. And so what Henry was expecting was that the Pope would simply agree, grant the annulment, and Henry could go on, marry another woman, and produce a male son. And popes were traditionally, over the course of history, I mean, sometimes popes would, refuse these type of requests from kings, but in the most part, popes and kings, they want to be on the, good terms with each other, and the Pope would be more than likely willing to grant that annulment. But the problem for the Pope at that point was Clement VII, a de Medici, by the way, as Pope. And he probably would have been more than willing to grant it. But the fact was, he was in no condition to grant it because the papacy, much of Italy, was under the control of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. And Charles V was the nephew of Catherine. And so he's not going to tolerate this embarrassment to his aunt. And so he is going to take a very active role in preventing Clement from granting the annulment. The best that Clement can do is sort of put it all in a holding pattern. And the whole process drags on for years. The initial documentation of Henry pushing for the divorce comes in 1527. It's not going to be until 1533 that the issue gets resolved, at least to the satisfaction of Henry, by breaking from Rome, because the papacy Clement VII is basically dragging his feet in the whole proceeding, which is, of course, making Henry grow more and more frustrated with the whole process. The other what's the term I would like to use? The other variable with all of this is the figure of Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn was a lady in waiting at the court of Catherine. She was a lady in waiting to Catherine, and she catches Henry's eye. She's 11 years.
What waiting mean?
She was one of the servants, a maid servant to Catherine. I mean, she came from a noble family as well, but this is what the daughters of nobles did. They served the king, or they served the queen. And so that was her position, a lady. The title would be a lady in waiting for the queen. She basically is her companion, and helps her get dressed and keeps her company, and that sort of a thing. Well, she catches Henry's eye, and she is I don't know, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I guess. Henry found her very attractive. She's very well educated. She spent a good deal of her younger life at the court in France as a lady in waiting to the queen of the French king. And so she was very pro-French. She was very cultured, very educated, and very, very sly in her subtlety to lure Henry in. Because she's shrewd, and she sees a bigger picture. She doesn't just want to be a mistress to Henry. That's not going to accomplish anything. She wants to be his wife. And so Henry, who has this clear attraction to her. You just read the letters he wrote to her. It's like a a middle school kid, writing romantic notes to some girl they're in love with, whatever. And she just keeps him at bay. She keeps him at bay. She doesn't let him have anything. And that, of course, is infuriating him even more to push for this divorce, to get this divorce taken care of. But the whole thing drags on for a long time. The Pope sends over a papal legate, his spokesperson. There's a long, drawn-out court trial that takes place, and nothing comes of it. The whole thing drags on for years and years because Catherine, the wife, simply won't play along. She refuses to give the divorce. She refuses to say that she had done anything wrong or that there was anything wrong with the marriage. And so it's a long, drawn-out process to say that. I mean, we could get involved in a long discussion about legal precedent and all of that, because it becomes very deeply legal, right? That Henry and Henry's lawyers, who were basically doing what Henry said, they were doing two things. They were trying to push the case that there is a breach of ecclesiastical law by Henry having married his brother's widow, breaking the rules that are put forth in Leviticus. Most canon lawyers would say Henry actually has a very weak case, but it's Henry, and Henry's got to get what Henry wants, and Henry says we have to argue from that perspective. The better case that Henry could have argued was the dispensation from the Pope to allow the marriage in the first place. Now, this is a threat to the papal authority that he's challenging here, right? But what the papacy should have done, and what Henry should have gone along with, is both Henry and Catherine are actually arguing the wrong legal point from their various perspectives. What Henry is arguing, the point is that the marriage between Catherine and his brother had been consummated, that they had slept together and it was a consummated marriage. That's the point Henry's going to argue. Catherine always denied that. Catherine said that she went to Henry as a virgin, that she had never consummated her marriage to Arthur. In papal law, they're both arguing the wrong position. What Henry would have been better off arguing is the marriage had never been consummated, and that way there are no grounds of affinity between Henry and Catherine, and therefore the marriage could have been voided, right? Whereas Catherine, arguing that the marriage had never been consummated. Let me get the position right. Henry was arguing the marriage had been consummated. It would have been in a meta position for Henry to argue. In other words, they're both arguing the wrong point of view legally here, but that doesn't change the fact that Henry, what ultimately propels the divorce is that eventually Anne Boleyn gets pregnant. Eventually she breaks down, she sleeps with Henry, and we pretty much know the exact moment of that happened. It happened at the Christmas celebrations in 1532. Henry had gone over to France, to Calais, and he was going to meet with the French king, and he brought Anne Boleyn with him. Anne Boleyn, who had been just recently elevated to the peerage, she was made a countess, right? And she accompanies Henry. And at some point during the Christmas festivities, she broke down and gave in to him, and they slept together. And guess what happens to her? By January, she finds out she's pregnant. Henry has to move really quickly now so that this can be a legitimate marriage and a legitimate child, because if they weren't married, it'd just be another bastard child, and they're not going to inherit the throne. And so Henry was in a very fortunate position, because just prior to that, his Archbishop of Canterbury had died, and he appoints a new individual as Archbishop of Canterbury, which is confirmed by the papacy, Thomas Cranmer. And Thomas Cranmer is a reformer. Thomas Cranmer was sympathetic to the ideas of the Lutherans. And Thomas Cranmer was more than willing to be Henry's hatchet man to break the ties with Rome. And so when Cranmer is appointed archbishop, Cranmer takes matters into his own hands. He has a legal court drawn up at Canterbury, and basically they say, okay, Henry gets what he wants. The marriage to Catherine is annulled. That marriage never took place. And then he officiates the marriage with Anne Boleyn. Of course, the Catholic Church will never recognize that, right? That couldn't be. In fact, Cranmer was excommunicated by the Pope for those actions, but the deed was done and England sets off in a new direction. The way Henry was able to accomplish this is a number of different factors at play here. First and foremost is Henry works through Parliament and he works through convocation. Convocation is the religious equivalent of Parliament. It's the meeting of the bishops. The archbishop and the bishops meet in convocation, and then you have the members, the House of Parliament that meets. And in both of these grounds, Henry uses the law to his great advantage, and so begins to break the ties from Rome. And the members of the hierarchy, the church hierarchy in England, to a man, all are willing to go along with Henry. They fear what Henry could potentially do to them. And so they grant Henry the title as supreme head of the church in England as far as the laws of God allowed. And so regardless of their own political or their own particular theological positions, all of them to a man are willing to accept Henry as the leader of the church in England and break ties with Rome, which is an amazing feat in and of itself. And then from the political perspective, Parliament passes these laws, these series of laws that are going to be passed in 1532, 1533, 1534, that break the ties that Rome had over it. Ever since the Middle Ages throughout Europe, every nation in Europe has two separate governments functioning, right? You have the secular government that's run by the king, but then you have the church government that's run through the papacy, through the various bishops and archbishops in Europe. So you have a whole series of ecclesiastical courts that are in existence in Europe. One of the first steps that Parliament takes is what's called the supplication. The name of it was the supplication against the ordinaries. The ordinaries were a reference to ecclesiastical courts. And so what that supplication against the ordinaries does is it eliminates ecclesiastical courts in England. There's only one court in England now. It's Parliament. There's no longer an ecclesiastical court. And then the other measures that are taken by Parliament is what's known as the restraint of annates. Annates were a reference to the income from a bishopric, and the first year's annates of a new bishop would go to Rome, right, as a sort of payment for receiving this bishopric. Well, Parliament says, no, you're not doing that. There's no more annates that are going to be given to Rome. They cut off the funds going to Rome. And then the final and the even more pressing, more important case is in 1534, the restraint of appeals, that no one in England could any longer make an appeal to Rome to pass judgment over any case, that any case in England has to be settled in England. And in one of the important lines in the restraint of appeals is, it reads, "This nation of England, which is an empire and has been so deemed as an empire, is visibly coming off, politically cutting the ties, ecclesiastical ties, political ties with Rome." And so with Parliament on his side, with the bishops in line on his side, this all gives legitimacy then to Henry's break from Rome. Even though, of course, if you were a devout Catholic, you would say Henry's wrong, the marriage with Anne is illegitimate, and all of that. The other thing that was passed in 1534 was the Act of Supremacy, where everyone in England had to recognize Henry as the head of the church in England. And failure to do that would be seen as an act of treason, where you would be arrested and potentially executed. And so everybody, except for a very few, fall in line with these designs of Henry. The two most visible individuals that refused to go along with the Act of Supremacy were John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, one of the bishops, and Thomas More, who was his former chancellor. Both of those individuals are thrown in the Tower, and within a year or so, both of them will have their heads cut off for their opposition to Henry. In reality, there was very little force used in Henry's Reformation. Most people go along with it. You have the case of Fisher and Moore that get beheaded, and then there was the case of the 12 Carthusian monks who refused to recognize the Act of Supremacy, and they were all executed. They were all hanged, drawn, and quartered as traitors in England. And other than that, there was very little in the way of physical force that was used to bring England in line with Henry and his break from Rome.
Okay, so from the time of the divorce with Catherine and the marriage to Anne Boleyn,
right,
it's really a clear break with Rome from that point forward. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. Of course, Catherine, the first wife, she will never recognize the divorce. She always considered herself the wife of Henry, and she dies a few years later. She died in 1536, most likely of a broken heart for the man she loved, having denied that they were ever married. And so Catherine had, a lot of sympathetic supporters on her side, but not enough to change Henry's position in his break from Rome. The other thing that's very successful in Henry's break from Rome is that doctrinally, Henry's church was a Catholic church. And that is in nowhere better seen than in the passing by Parliament, the passing of what was known as the 6 Articles of Faith. And these 6 Articles of Faith are doctrinally Catholic. Go through them. They're all Catholic. They're not Protestant at all. And so I think most people in England are willing to tolerate that. They're willing to say, yeah, we're basically a Catholic church. We don't have the Pope, but the Pope was all the way over there in Rome anyway. So what do we need a Pope for? But in terms of our lives, in terms of our church worship, nothing much has really changed. So
okay, but the fact that Henry was able to get away with this and make himself the head of the church in England, is this a significant contributing factor to the rise of monarchical absolutism?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Henry in every way could have been an absolutist, except for the fact of Parliament. Parliament, of course, the origins of Parliament go back to the 13th century, is too firmly entrenched at that point. And Henry is smart enough to realize that he needs to utilize and work with Parliament to accomplish his ends, as opposed to France, for example, a century later, where when absolutism takes hold in France, the French king never calls the Estates General, which is the French equivalent of Parliament. And for almost 200 years, French absolutism never sees the need to call that parliamentary body. Whereas in the case of England, Parliament is there to stay. Parliament works hand in hand with the king. Henry asserts tremendous power. Henry has he wields tremendous power, and he basically gets what he wants. But he has to always be very careful to work with Parliament to accomplish those ends. And he was smart enough that he never really went against Parliament. And he tries his best to manipulate Parliament as best he could. So
All right. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. I'm trying to work it out in my mind because at this stage, I mean, would you go so far as does Parliament really provide a real political check on the king, or is it more just? I mean, how would you characterize that relationship?
Um, a political check to certain degrees in the 16th century, but not to the point where Parliament is driving the boat at that. Parliament is not in the driver's seat at that point. The king is really the senior partner and the one in the driver's seat. Parliament can make certain, for example, when Queen Elizabeth I becomes queen, Parliament refuses to recognize the title of her as supreme head of the church. It can't bring itself to accept a woman as the supreme head of the church. And so Elizabeth is forced to accept the term supreme governess of the church. I mean, that seems like a subtle little distinction, but it has some significance to it that she was forced to go with what Parliament wanted in that instance, rather than asserting what she would have wanted, which would have been to assume the same title that her father had as supreme head of the church.
So by the
Yeah,
time we get to Elizabeth, we
yeah.
start to see the Church of England assuming a more distinct identity from the Catholic Church, right? And
Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. When you look at the composition of the bishops, the archbishops and the bishops in the reign of Henry VIII, there were some of those bishops that had clearly Protestant leanings, but they're in the minority, I'd say. So you have Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, you had Jasper Ridley, you had Hugh Latimer, you had Hooper, a couple of others that had Protestant leanings, but most of the other bishops at that point were much more conservative and certainly much more doctrinally Catholic, although they are willing to tolerate the break administratively from Rome. But notice what happens when Mary comes to the throne. All of those bishops, save for Cranmer, Latimer, and Ridley, all are willing to accept the return to Catholicism. It's only those three that were then imprisoned by Mary for their heresy in terms of their religious position. But then they're flexible again. When Elizabeth comes to the throne, those bishops that have the more Catholic leanings, well, she gets rid of them either through arrest or eventual death. So the Bishop of London, for example, Bishop Bonner, who was the Bishop of London, who was a good, he was a good example of an individual who's willing to go along with Henry's Reformation, then go back to becoming a devout Catholic under Mary, and then refuses to give up that Catholicism under Elizabeth, and Elizabeth throws him in prison, and he ends up spending his remaining days in prison. And so Elizabeth then has the luxury of appointing individuals, because it's the monarch's role to help appoint these individuals as bishops, and make sure that you have individuals with Protestant leanings then become bishops under her.
okay, so under Mary, there was like a temporary rapprochement with Rome.
There's a actual return to Rome.
Okay,
That the Roman Church once again begins to assert its authority in England under Mary, and a papal legate is sent in the form of the new Archbishop of Canterbury, who's a Catholic. De la Pole was his name. Reginald de la Pole as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And
so
one of the interesting facts, though, that Mary was not able to change, and this is one of the very important things in the reign of Henry VIII, was the disillusionment of the English monasteries. There was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 800 monasteries in England, from the Middle Ages up until the 16th century. And some of these monastic houses were very wealthy. They controlled, land, they have wealth. And Henry begins the process of breaking those monasteries, dissolving those monasteries. That's really the action of the other mastermind of the English Reformation, Thomas Cromwell. And Thomas Cromwell becomes Henry's principal minister. And it's Cromwell that orchestrates the disillusionment of the monastery. So eventually, by 1540, all of the English monastic houses were dissolved. And where does all that real estate, where does all that land, where does all that wealth go? It goes into the hands of the king. Now, if Henry was smart, he could have become an absolute monarch at that point, because he could have used that wealth that's coming in. But instead, Henry was wasteful. Henry wants to get involved in another war against France. And so at least 2/3 of that monastic land is sold. And the people that buy that land, many of them the rising gentry, the gentry class in England, at the beginning of Henry's reign, there were 144 gentry class families in England. By the end of the reign of Elizabeth, there were 366 gentry class families in England. So the gentry are clearly on the rise in the 16th century. And these gentry families that had got this land are, of course, not going to want to give it back. And even Mary, when she becomes queen, made no effort to try to return that monastic land back to the church. And that's going to be an important element in securing the Protestant success in the Reformation, was the disillusionment of the monasteries in England. Oh, and by the way, the disillusionment of the monasteries led to another one of the revolts Henry had to deal with, what was known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, where individuals, devout Catholics, are basically rebelling against Henry because of the dissolution of the monasteries. And Henry, like everything else, puts it down with severe ruthlessness. Henry, if you got on Henry's bad side, you better be careful, because Henry was a ruthless individual. So,
and I was going to ask earlier, by the time of Elizabeth, I mean,
yes.
you mentioned the sort of the prominent church figures who she had executed, right?
Right.
For ordinary,
Well, she didn't really, no, she never executed them. She imprisoned
okay.
them.
All right. So for ordinary people from that point in time, was it safe to be a practicing Catholic in England?
No.
Okay.
No, they had to go underground.
Yeah.
Elizabeth made no active effort to persecute Catholics. She put financial penalties on them, like individuals that refused to worship in the Church of England had to pay fines. Catholics who were caught secretly worshiping could have been arrested and imprisoned. And under Elizabeth, there's certainly a great deal of pressure on any Catholic missionaries that come over to England to try to win back converts. And the Elizabethan state persecutes with tremendous ferocity any Catholic missionaries that they discovered, but because they were seen as being treasonous to the English political nation. And so in the course of Mary's reign, there are close to 300 individuals that she executed, and she executed all of them for heresy because they refused to go back to the Roman Catholic Church. In the course of Elizabeth's reign, there are at least as many, if not more, that are executed, but they're not executed for the act of heresy. They're executed for the act of treason, and that's a different legal beast, right?
Let me ask you, Bob, when did the line of the current royal family begin?
The current royal family?
Yeah.
It began in the early 18th century in 1714 with the Hanoverian succession to the throne. And so Queen Elizabeth II is a direct descendant of the Hanoverians, but through other lines in the family, all English monarchs trace themselves back to early medieval times. They had these elaborate family trees.
There's not a direct family line on the throne from Queen Elizabeth I to Queen Elizabeth II.
No, because Queen Elizabeth I dies. Queen Elizabeth I was a great monarch. She'll go down in history as being the top, in the top 5 English monarchs in terms of what she's able to accomplish during her rule. Her one failing is she never married. So she's never able to produce an heir. So the Tudor dynasty comes to an end with her death in 1603. And then because of the new parliamentary rules that had been established, that the monarch of England has to be a Protestant. And so then what you do is you look for the closest male Protestant heir to Elizabeth. And that brings us back to the elder sister of Henry VIII, Margaret, who had married the Scottish king. And it's their descendant that then becomes Elizabeth's heir as James I of England. James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England in 1603.
So with the royal family today,
yeah,
like when you have someone like Meghan Markle marrying into the royal family, is there an expectation or a requirement that she convert to the Anglican Church?
She did. She had to.
Right,
Yes.
and that's expected. She asked.
Yeah. And that, and in fact, that created it. I don't know if you remember back into the early 1970s when Prince Charles was dating a Belgian princess, and she was Catholic, of course, and there was great concern in England of what could potentially happen with that, because that's against the law, against the English king, or the future English king cannot marry a Catholic.
Right.
So, because the English king is the head of the Church of England.
Right. Well, Bob, this has all been super interesting. Wow, so much information.
Much information, huh?
Exploding. But I definitely appreciate it, and I'm sure our viewers will as well. So thanks a lot.
Well, I have plenty more to talk about if you want to go on longer. So
that'll be part 2.
Okay, part 2. All right. Nice talking with you. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.